trillion, specifically $519 billion. This represents the largest bilateral economic proposal ever made between two nations during peacetime, a sum 3 times greater than the entire Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Western Europe after World War II. Yet, the response was a definitive no, not a maybe or a request to negotiate, just a flat rejection. The President of the United States, representing the world's largest economy, offered this staggering amount to the Prime Minister of Canada, only for Mark Carney to send it back. In the next 20 minutes, I'll take you through the specifics of that offer, the reasons behind Canada's rejection, the current situation at border crossings in Windsor and Niagara Falls, and what Warren Buffett described as the most telling economic moment of the entire trade war. By the end, you'll grasp why analysts suggest this marks the moment when America transitioned from being the nation that writes checks to one whose checks are returned. If you haven't already, subscribe to Sarah Mitchell's YouTube channel now. This situation is a game changer. Let's rewind, not weeks or months, but to the moment when Washington began to believe its own narrative. The prevailing idea was that American economic power was so dominant that any country could be coerced into compliance with enough financial pressure. This belief has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy, and this week, it showed signs of cracking. The White House proposed what it termed the North American Health Security Compact, a 5-year bilateral agreement valued at $519 billion. The explicit aim was to restore pharmaceutical supply chains that Canada had severed due to escalating tariff pressures. The deal was leaked to Reuters before Prime Minister Carney even received the formal proposal, a calculated move intended to generate public pressure and force Canada's hand before Ottawa could respond effectively. The strategy was clear. If the American public saw the generous offer and Carney rejected it, Canada would be painted as the villain. However, the logic and clarity of Carney's rejection were so compelling that it was President Trump, not Carney, who appeared unreasonable. The leak strategy backfired spectacularly. Now, let's analyze the numbers, as the breakdown of that $519 billion reveals much about the situation. $85 billion for guaranteed pharmaceutical export contracts. The U.S. was willing to pay above market rates for drug ingredients, finished generic medications, and insulin intermediaries, not just the market price, but above it. This was essentially a surcharge for damaging a relationship. $140 billion for joint U.S.-Canadian pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities. This would involve new factories built in Canada funded by American money with the infrastructure owned by Canada. This reflects a startling reality. The richest country in history was offering to build drug factories abroad because it couldn't meet its own domestic demand. $95 billion for a health security reserve. This included prepaid stockpiles of essential drugs stored in joint U.S.-Canadian warehouses along the border. The U.S. was essentially paying Canada to hold its medicine, akin to a patient paying a pharmacy to store their prescriptions due to a lack of trust in their own home. $62 billion for cross-border healthcare infrastructure aimed at creating new processing facilities, expedited customs lanes for medical goods, and digital tracking systems for pharmaceutical shipments. This was an investment to rebuild a logistics network that had previously functioned seamlessly, but had been disrupted by the same administration now proposing to fix it. $37 billion was earmarked for direct investment in the Canadian healthcare system, money flowing directly into Canadian hospitals and research institutions as a goodwill gesture, not a loan or investment. This was a desperate attempt to win favor with Canada to resume the flow of medicines. This was the price of goodwill after 18 months of deteriorating relations, and it still wasn't sufficient. It's crucial to understand that Trump didn't make this offer from a position of strength. He did so because all other options had failed. The tariffs responsible for the pharmaceutical blockade remained in place, yet every countermeasure had fallen short. Orders under the Defense Production Act, calls to OPEC, National Guard deployments, and emergency production mandates had failed to restore the flow of medicine. Reports indicated that hospital drug inventories in northern states were nearing critical lows, with insulin rationing imminent in hospitals across Michigan, Ohio, and Minnesota. Delays in chemotherapy treatments were increasing, and antibiotic shortages were forcing doctors to prescribe less effective alternatives. The American Medical Association publicly labeled the situation a public health emergency of the first order. The individuals affected were not just Democratic constituents in urban areas, they were Trump's own voters, insulin dependent diabetics in rural Ohio, cancer patients in Michigan, and seniors across the Midwest who had relied on affordable prescriptions from Canadian pharmacies, now cut off and facing exorbitant American prices. The calls flooding congressional offices came not from liberal activists, but from MAGA supporters, people who had once rallied for Trump, now running out of medicine and placing the blame squarely on him. Governors were demanding federal action daily, while hospital administrators appeared on television with empty shelves behind them, amplifying the political pressure. In this context, Carney's response was strikingly succinct. His press conference in Ottawa lasted just 4 minutes. He stood alone at the podium, without support of ministers or flags, conveying a powerful message with minimal fanfare. He acknowledged receipt of the proposal and thanked the U.S. for recognizing the severity of the healthcare crisis created by its own policies. By using the word "its," Carney assigned full ownership of the crisis to Washington. He then delivered the rejection. This is a generous financial proposal, but Canada's pharmaceutical exports are not for sale. Our cooperation is not a commodity. You cannot purchase a partnership. He emphasized that the U.S. didn't have a spending problem. It had a policy problem. The healthcare crisis stemmed from tariffs and could only be resolved by lifting them. No amount of money could substitute for the necessary policy change that would resolve the crisis immediately and at no cost. Carney's measured tone and clarity redefined the relationship between the two nations. In those 4 minutes, he did something no foreign leader has done in modern history. He sent the money back. Carney's rejection was layered, each aspect more impactful than the last. The tariffs causing the pharmaceutical blockade remained unaddressed. Trump's offer attempted to restore healthcare supply chains without removing the tariffs that had led to their disruption. This scenario is akin to a neighbor repeatedly damaging your fence and then offering a large sum to build a new one while the damage continues. Carney insisted on stopping the damage first. Carney framed the offer as transactional, suggesting that the U.S. believed it could pay Canada to comply without changing its own behavior. Canadian officials expressed that the offer reflected a view of Canada as a mere supplier needing compensation rather than as a sovereign nation and ally. The proposed $37 billion for Canadian hospitals, seen as a generous gift in Washington, was perceived in Ottawa as a bribe. Carney recognized the potential trap of accepting funds to restore pharmaceutical supply chains while tariffs remained. Accepting the money would set a dangerous precedent: impose tariffs, face consequences, then offer a bailout. The only way to break this cycle was to reject the funds and demand policy change. Carney opted for the long-term solution over a short-term payoff. While Ottawa was returning the funds and Washington was grappling with the rejection, a more visceral situation unfolded at the border. Thousands of Americans were driving to Canadian border crossings in search of prescription drugs, not tourists or shoppers, but medical refugees. They arrived at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, and various other checkpoints, carrying empty prescription bottles and insurance cards, hoping that Canadian pharmacies might have what their American ones lacked. Windsor faced the brunt of this surge. The Ambassador Bridge and the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel experienced unprecedented traffic, with lines of Americans stretching down city blocks. Some were elderly, some in wheelchairs, some holding children, all desperately seeking medicine. Canadian pharmacies in border towns quickly ran out of insulin and antibiotics due to the overwhelming demand. One pharmacy owner in Windsor reported serving more American customers in 3 days than Canadian ones in the previous month, stating, "I want to help them, but I have diabetic patients in Windsor who need insulin too. I can't give it all away." This situation is not hypothetical. It's the reality of a trade dispute weaponizing a supply chain worth an estimated $3 billion in annual pharmaceutical exports. Research from the University of Toronto indicated that applying 25% tariffs to Canadian pharmaceuticals could add $750 million in costs to the U.S. market and jeopardize over 400 medications, including 28 with no alternative suppliers worldwide. One particularly haunting image that went viral showed a 63-year-old woman from Dearborn, Michigan, sitting on the curb on the Canadian side of the tunnel, clutching an empty insulin vial and crying. She had driven 40 minutes to Canada, waited 3 hours in line, and when she reached the pharmacy, they were out of stock. With only 4 days of insulin left at home, she faced an uncertain future. Another poignant scene unfolded at Niagara Falls, where a father and his 12-year-old son, both type 1 diabetics, sat in a minivan with Ohio plates in a line stretching 1.5 miles from the Rainbow Bridge. They had left Columbus at 4 a.m. with a cooler full of ice packs for insulin, but after a 6-hour wait, the pharmacy they had called ahead had run out. They drove to 3 more pharmacies in the Niagara region, all empty, and returned home with an empty cooler and a boy who had only 11 days of insulin left. These are not just statistics. These are Americans, citizens of the wealthiest nation in history, driving hundreds of miles to another country to obtain essential medicine and being turned away empty-handed. Canadian border authorities began turning away Americans seeking medical purchases, not out of cruelty, but because Canadian pharmacies could not meet the surge in demand without impacting their own patients. One border agent lamented, "I'm telling grandmothers they can't come in to buy medicine. That's not what I signed up for. But if I let everyone through, our own people can't get their prescriptions filled." This is the stark reality of this trade war, not tariff tables or GDP projections, but a border agent informing a diabetic from Michigan that Canada cannot assist her due to insufficient medicine for everyone. Enhanced customs protocols remained in effect, causing commercial trucks to back up 20 to 30 miles at the Ambassador Bridge, the Peace Bridge, and the Blue Water Bridge. Average crossing times skyrocketed from 45 minutes to between 14 and 18 hours. Perishable goods were spoiling in trucks, and pharmaceutical shipments requiring temperature control arrived ruined on the other side. Auto parts, which needed to cross the border 6 to 8 times during vehicle assembly, were adding an entire day to each crossing. A car that previously took 3 days to assemble now required 3 weeks. Ford announced a suspension of production at 2 Michigan plants, while GM warned of layoffs at its Flint assembly facility. Stellantis pulled workers from its Windsor plant, causing the industrial backbone of the Great Lakes region to grind to a halt due to the inability to move parts quickly across the border. As reported by Reuters, the border that once processed approximately $2.5 billion in daily trade was now operating at about 30% capacity, translating to $1.75 billion in trade not crossing each day. In a week, that amounted to $12.4 billion, and over a month, more than $50 billion. The border wasn't closed, it was strangled. Every hour it remained in this state compounded the damage. Communities built around that border, Detroit and Windsor, Buffalo and Niagara, Seattle and Vancouver, were fracturing. A nurse in Windsor, working at a hospital in Detroit, was unable to reach her shift because the crossing took 4 hours. A teacher in Buffalo could not visit her mother in St. Catharines on weekends. Cross-border workers, an estimated 75,000 people living in one country and working in the other, watched their livelihoods collapse. Small businesses that relied on cross-border customers saw revenues plummet by 60 to 80%. Restaurants in Niagara Falls, which had served American tourists for 50 years, were closing, and auto shops in Windsor that serviced cars from both countries were laying off mechanics. The human fabric of border life, woven over generations of peaceful coexistence, was being shredded by a trade war that those communities never asked for and cannot escape. The border, once invisible for generations, had become a wall constructed by the trade war. Warren Buffett released a statement following Carney's rejection, shorter than his usual commentary, more direct and stripped of his folksy warmth. He wrote, "In my experience, the most important moment in any negotiation is when one side offers money and the other side says no. This is when you discover who truly holds the power. The person with the money believes they have the power, but the one who can refuse money, who can look at $500 billion and say, "That's not what I want," possesses something money can't buy: leverage. And leverage always trumps capital. He elaborated further. The president offered $519 billion. The prime minister said no. In that exchange, the entire relationship between these two countries was redefined. America was once the nation that set the terms. Now it was the country that offered terms and faced rejection. This situation transcended a mere trade dispute. It represented a transfer of power. Buffett's analysis of the offer was incisive. By putting $519 billion on the table, the United States simultaneously admitted three things. It cannot supply its own medicine, it cannot compel Canada to supply it, and it is willing to pay any price to resolve the crisis. These three admissions together signify the most significant shift in North American economic relations in my lifetime. Canada now understands all three of these truths, and so does every other nation observing this situation. He paused, then delivered a line that will be studied in foreign policy classrooms for decades. China knows, the EU knows, Japan knows, every nation on earth that has ever negotiated with the United States now knows that when America is desperate enough, it offers money. And when that money is rejected, America has nothing left. That is the lesson of this week. Not the $519 billion, but the emptiness that follows, along with the calculation that defines this entire chapter of American economic history. What fascinates me is that there is a solution to this crisis that costs nothing: remove the tariffs. Pharmaceutical exports would resume within 48 hours. Canada has stated this publicly, repeatedly, and explicitly: $0. Yet, the president would rather offer $519 billion of taxpayer money than admit the tariffs were a mistake. Consider what this reveals about the cost of ego in American governance. $519 billion is the price of not admitting wrongdoing. His final line struck a chord. I've used words like obituary, demolish, and morally obscene to describe what this trade war has done. Today, I'd use the word humiliation, not because Canada humiliated America, but because America humiliated itself. The offer was humiliating. The rejection was simply honest. This rejection left Trump in the worst position of his presidency on the world stage. Every government watched the United States offer $500 billion and get told no. Multiple international outlets reported that China took note. The European Union took note. Japan took note. The foundational assumption of American economic diplomacy for 75 years, that America can buy its way out of any crisis, shattered in a 4-minute press conference in Ottawa. Domestically, the rejection offended every faction of Trump's coalition simultaneously. Fiscal conservatives viewed it as a $500 billion giveaway, with the House Freedom Caucus issuing a statement within hours calling it the most irresponsible spending proposal in American history. National security hawks saw it as submission to a foreign government, with one senator labeling it the diplomatic equivalent of writing a ransom check. Economic populists were outraged at American taxpayer money flowing to Canadian hospitals while American hospitals struggled with drug shortages. All of them watched the offer get rejected. Congressional reaction was swift and bipartisan in its horror. Democrats labeled the offer an admission of catastrophic policy failure, while Republicans called it fiscally insane. Both sides were correct. The only consensus was that the offer should never have been made. So, let's discuss where this situation goes from here. Trump's options have narrowed to a single corridor. Option A: remove the tariffs. Pharmaceutical supply resumes within 48 hours at no cost, but this requires admitting an error, politically impossible for this president. Option B: offer more money. But Carney has made it explicitly clear that the amount is irrelevant. The issue is tariffs, not dollars. $1 trillion would be rejected in the same manner. Option C: escalate further by imposing more tariffs or sanctions. However, the pharmaceutical blockade was caused by tariffs in the first place. More tariffs mean more blockades and a deeper crisis. Trump himself threatened pharmaceutical tariffs as high as 250%, a number that should terrify every American who relies on prescription medications. Option D, do nothing. The healthcare crisis worsens daily, with insulin rationing approaching, antibiotic shortages deepening, and cancer treatment delays mounting. Americans are suffering and dying. Every option leads to the same conclusion: remove the tariffs. It's the only viable solution, yet it's the one door Trump has welded shut. Images from the border are dominating every news cycle. Republican governors in border states are publicly demanding action. Michigan's governor stated, "My constituents are driving to Canada to get medicine." That is a failure of the federal government. Full stop. New York's governor activated emergency state pharmaceutical reserves, a temporary measure that buys weeks, not months. The framing of medical refugees is devastating because it flips the traditional narrative regarding the border crisis. For years, political discussions about the U.S. border have focused on people trying to enter America. This border crisis is about Americans trying to leave to obtain medicine from the country their president started a trade war with the richest nation on earth. Citizens are driving to a foreign border carrying empty prescription bottles, only to be turned away by agents who inform them that there isn't enough medicine for everyone. That image is the legacy of the trade war, and it's one that no political strategist in Washington knows how to spin. The clock keeps ticking. Hospital drug inventories are declining daily. Insulin is weeks away from critical shortage levels. Generic antibiotics are already being allocated in some hospital systems, with doses being rationed. Chemotherapy compounds are down to 2 to 3 weeks of supply for certain treatments at some centers. Each day the tariffs remain in place, the healthcare crisis deepens. Each day the offer sits rejected, the border crisis worsens. Each day Trump refuses to say 3 words, more Americans run out of medicine. $519 billion, that was the offer. No, that was the answer. Somewhere between the offer and the answer, the world changed. Not because of the money, but because of what the rejection proved, that the most powerful country on earth had managed to put itself in a position where its money didn't matter, its threats failed, and its citizens were lining up at a foreign border to plead for medicine. The tariffs are still in place. The pharmaceutical blockade is still active. The border crisis is still escalating. And the only solution costs nothing except the one thing this president values more than the health of his own people: his pride. 3 questions I want to leave you with. Is Carney saving Canada's sovereignty or gambling with it? At what point does the principled rejection of money become indistinguishable from watching people suffer? And the question Buffett answered with devastating clarity: when the dust finally settles on this trade war, which country will history judge as the one that put politics above people? If this analysis gave you something to think about, subscribe to Daily Brief and hit that notification bell. New breakdowns will drop every time the situation evolves.